before we start, I want to encourage you to have a set of the sermon notes. If you'll go to the link below, you'll be able to print a set of the sermon notes from that link. Also want to encourage you to have some communion elements. You want to have some bread or a cracker. You want to have some juice or some wine, and if you don't have juice or wine, probably anything to drink would work. But you'll want to have those communion elements because here in about 20 minutes when we get to the end of the sermon, we'll move right into a time of communion with you. So if you need any of those things, I would encourage you to pause the video right now. Grab whatever you need. Once everything is ready, then go ahead and resume the playback. So, when was the last time that someone was talking to you about something with which you didn't really want to talk about it and you tried to change the subject? Or am I the only one who's ever done that? My guess is that if you are like me, then you've probably done exactly that at some point in your life. Maybe that's something that you have to do, like me, on a regular basis, where you have to try to change the subject because someone has brought up something that you don't really want to talk about. Well, the reason that I bring that up is because in the lectionary gospel reading we're going to be taking a look at today, that is exactly what one of the disciples tries to do, and we'll find out if it works or not. Right now, we're going to pick up essentially where we left off last week. Last week, we took a look at Mark chapter 8. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Mark chapter 9, which is the lectionary gospel reading for this morning. And this morning, we're going to be taking a look at the Message translation. So, let's go ahead and jump in at Mark chapter 9, verse 30. Jesus told the disciples, "The Son of Man is about to be betrayed by some people who want nothing to do with God. They will murder the Son of Man. 3 days after his murder, he will rise alive." The disciples didn't know what Jesus was talking about, but were afraid to ask him about it. They came to Capernaum. When they were safe at home, Jesus asked them, "Hey, what were you discussing on the road?" And the silence was deafening. They had been arguing with one another over who among them was greatest. Jesus sat down and summoned the 12. "So, you want first place? Then take the last place. Be the servant of all." Jesus put a child in the middle of the room. Then, cradling the little one in his arms, Jesus said, "Whoever embraces one of these children as I do, embraces me, and far more than me, God who sent me." John spoke up, "Teacher, we saw a man using your name to expel demons, and we stopped him because he wasn't in our group." Jesus wasn't pleased. "Don't stop him. No one can use my name to do something good and powerful and in the next breath slam me. If he's not an enemy, he's an ally. Why, anyone, just by giving you a cup of water in my name, is on our side. Count on it that God will notice. On the other hand, if you give one of these simple childlike believers a hard time, bullying or taking advantage of their simple trust, you'll soon wish you hadn't. You'd be better off dropped in the middle of the lake with a millstone around your neck. If your hand or foot gets in God's way, chop it off and throw it away. You're better off maimed or lame and alive than the proud owner of 2 hands and 2 feet, godless in a furnace of eternal fire. And if your eye distracts you from God, pull it out and throw it away. You're better off one-eyed and alive than exercising your 20/20 vision from inside the fire of hell. Everyone's going through a refining fire sooner or later, but you'll be well preserved, protected from the eternal flames. Be preservatives yourselves. Preserve the peace." May God bless the reading of the Word. Now, as I've talked about before, I know that sometimes the Message translation does some interesting things, but what I would encourage you to do, as I've done in the past, is if you'd like to compare this to the New International Version or the King James, whatever is your translation of choice, then just take this and set it side by side with the New International Version or the King James or whatever, and read them, because I think that there are a number of the nuances in this passage that the Message translation does a really nice job of pulling out those nuances and helping to explain some things that might otherwise be kind of confusing, even in the NIV, much less the King James. So, let's do what we always do. Let's see if I can try to make this, even as it is, in the Message translation, make a little more sense. Let's talk through the passage, and then after we talk through the passage, then we'll focus on 3 of the many, many, many lessons that this passage has for us. So, last week, if you watched the online sermon, then you know that we were talking about Mark chapter 8. And one of the things that Jesus did in Mark chapter 8 was he explained to the disciples that he, as the Messiah, was going to be rejected by the religious leaders, that he was going to be killed, and that he was going to rise again. You might remember that actually it was Peter that objected to that, and Peter tried to pull Jesus aside, tried to rebuke him for saying those things, and Jesus turned right around and rebuked Peter in front of all of the disciples and said, "Get behind me, Satan." Well, here we are once again, and once again Jesus is trying to explain the same thing, that he, as the Son of Man, as the Messiah, he is going to be put to death, and that 3 days later he is going to rise from the dead. Right here in the very first paragraph, in verses 30 through 32, that's what he explained to the disciples, and once again, they don't understand it. It kind of is mind-boggling that it just wasn't getting through their thick skulls. But they don't understand it. They're afraid to talk about it. They are traveling, and when they get back to their home base in Capernaum, Jesus says, "Hey, I noticed you guys were talking about something amongst yourselves back there. Seemed like you're getting a little animated about it. What were you talking about?" And the passage tells us that they don't really want to tell Jesus what they were talking about, because what they were talking about was completely and utterly ridiculous. Because they were arguing over which one of them, as the 12, was the greatest. And Jesus uses this as a teachable moment. He uses this as a teaching moment and says, "All right, guys, bring it in. If any of you wants to be in first place, then you need to take the last place. You need to take the lowest place. You need to be the servant of everyone else." And then Jesus takes a child and says, "You need to be like this little one. And if you are humble like this little child, then you are embracing me in my teachings. Not only me, but you're embracing God." Now, because this has been an uncomfortable situation for the disciples, the fact that they were arguing over which one of them was the greatest, it's John, the disciple Jesus loved, aka the disciple Jesus loved, of all people, that tries to change the subject. And he says, "Well, hey, Jesus," not to change the subject, "but we saw somebody back there who was trying to cast out demons in your name, and so we told him to cut it out." And Jesus says, I don't know why you did that." Jesus says, "Look, if someone is trying to do something that's good, then that's a good thing." And Jesus says, "Look, if they're trying to do something that is going to be helpful to the mission of spreading the gospel, spreading the good news, then that is something that God will notice as well." But then notice what Jesus does in verse 42. He brings it back around to what he had been talking about before. John had tried to change the subject. Jesus doesn't fall for it. He brings it back around and he says, "What was I talking about before? Oh yeah, I was talking about how you yahoos, as you're arguing over which one of you is the greatest, how you actually need to try to be the most humble of the entire bunch." He says, humility is an important thing, and you need to be like this little one. You need to have simple childlike faith. And Jesus says, I'd also point out that if anyone tries to take advantage of any of these little ones, or anyone that's placed their trust in me, anyone who has simple childlike faith that has placed their trust in me or in the one true God, it would be better for them if a millstone had been hung around their neck and they'd been thrown in the middle of a lake. Now, I've talked about this before, but a millstone was not a small thing. A millstone wasn't like a rock. It wasn't like a big piece of jewelry. A millstone was a giant stone slab that they used thousands of years ago to grind grain into flour. And so a millstone would have been something that would have been even bigger than a human being. So to have a millstone that's even bigger than you, and it's solid stone, hung around your neck, and to be thrown in the middle of the lake, well, that's it for you. It's curtains. It's over for you. And so what Jesus was saying is, you don't want that to happen. And Jesus is saying, I don't want that to happen. So make sure that you don't take advantage of these people who have this simple, humble, childlike faith. And then Jesus kind of changes subjects himself, but in Jesus' case, I think it's okay because it was Jesus, and we are in the middle of a teachable, in the middle of a teachable moment right now. And Jesus says, now, let me give you another example. He says, if your hand or your foot causes you to sin, then cut them off and get rid of them. Jesus says, if your eye causes you to sin, then pull it out and get rid of it. Now, I think that what you've heard your entire life in terms of we aren't supposed to take that literally, obviously that is true. But Jesus' point is an excellent one. Whatever we have that's happening in our lives that is causing us to stumble, something that is coming between us and God, then we need to get rid of it. That's the point that Jesus is trying to make here. And then Jesus ends the passage by saying, look, I've been talking about hellfire in verses 43 through 48. He says, everyone is going to go through a refiner's fire sooner or later. And I think that you understand what Jesus was talking about when he was talking about refiner's fire. That's an image that's used a number of times in the New Testament. A refiner's fire was something that they used simply when they were trying to purify metals. So you're trying to purify gold, or you're trying to purify silver. You're trying to get all of the impurities out of gold, out of silver. So you put the gold, you put the silver through the refiner's fire. After you put it through the fire and all of the impurities are burned out, then you're left with pure gold. You're left with pure silver afterwards. And Jesus, of course, is using this in a metaphorical sense and saying all of us are going to be put through that refiner's fire at some point in our lives. But we will be well preserved. We will be protected from the eternal flames. And then Jesus says, speaking of being preserved, what you need to do is you need to be one who preserves others, and specifically, you need to preserve the peace. So, like I said, there's a lot in this passage. There's a whole lot, so much so that there's no way that we could possibly get through all of the lessons that Jesus has for us in this passage. For example, I'm not even going to talk about how in verse 42, Jesus discusses the way in which we aren't supposed to take advantage of others, although that could certainly be a point that I could talk about. I'm not going to even talk about in verses 43 and 48 through 48 how to eliminate the stumbling blocks in our lives, although that is another lesson that we certainly could discuss. I'm not even going to talk about what Jesus discusses in verses 49 and 50, the idea of going through a refiner's fire, because that's something that all of us will experience. And I'm not even going to talk about how Jesus concludes this passage by saying to us, we need to preserve the peace. So there's 4 lessons I'm just skipping over today. Maybe we can have part 2 of the sermon next week. But what I want to do is I want to focus on 3 of the lessons that Jesus shares even before we get to the end of the passage. And the first lesson is this: as disciples, we should help the helpless. As disciples, we should help the helpless. Now, Jesus in this passage, he takes a child, and he makes the child the object lesson for the disciples who had been arguing about which one of them was the greatest, and says, you want to be great, then you need to model yourself after this little one. And one of the things that we need to remind ourselves is that in that culture, 2,000 years ago, children were not first-class citizens. They weren't second-class citizens. I mean, children were third-class citizens at best. At best. And we have to remind ourselves that that was absolutely a culture 2,000 years ago in which children were expected to be seen and not heard. And children were not treated well. I mean, we know that historically in that culture. And so for Jesus to take this child and say to the disciples, you need to be like this little child, I mean, that would have been something they'd never heard before. And I would just very quickly say I'm glad that in the year 2024, that in our culture, that we do treat children like equal citizens. I'm glad that we have protections in place for children, because heaven knows that there have been a lot of bad things that have happened to children over the last 2 millennia, even within the church, which is so tragic and which goes against what Jesus has to say here to such an incredible extent that it just boggles my mind. But again, that's another subject for another time as well. The point here is that we, as disciples, need to help the helpless. Do children qualify as those who are helpless? Yes, they do. And I want you to know that here at Southview Christian Church, even though we're a small church, we have put protections in place for our children. That has been a subject of discussion here at this church over the past several months, and I'm proud of the things that we've done here to protect our children. But above and beyond children, we need to also ask, who are the other people who are helpless in our community, in our lives? And I think we can extend that list outward and talk about the elderly as well. Because something that we know happens in our society is we know that elder abuse is a real thing. And we can't allow that to happen either. Something else that can happen in our society and our culture is that the disabled can be abused. And look, if we extend it out from there, there are all sorts of people groups who have been marginalized, who have been mistreated. And look, I'm a white 54-year-old man, and I recognize the fact that our culture has, for the last 54 years of my life, has been set up to be pretty kind to me. And what I'm saying to you is I want everybody in our culture to be treated as well as I've been treated over the last 54 years. And I am making it a point in my life to try to make sure that everyone in my life and beyond is treated as well as culture has treated me over the course of my life so far. Enough said? Okay. That is the first lesson that this passage has for us. The second lesson is this: as disciples, we should support others' ministries. Bet you weren't expecting that, were you? As disciples, we should support others' ministries. When Jesus is talking to the disciples and saying, look, you need to stop trying to figure out which one of you is the greatest. And then John tries to change the subject and say, we saw some guy we don't even know that was trying to cast out demons in your name, so we shut that down. And Jesus says, don't shut that down. What are you doing? It's something that we don't talk about very often, but we, in this passage and in other places, we are encouraged to support others' ministries. And I think that it's interesting that in our culture, sometimes, specifically in our American culture, because we live in kind of a competitive culture. And I'll be the first to say that I'm pretty competitive as an individual in many areas of my life. But one thing that I hope I am never competitive about is the success of others' ministries. In fact, when other ministries, when other ministers are successful, then I hope that I am celebrating those ministries and those ministers, because that is a beautiful thing. And look, John was saying, we don't even know that guy. And to be clear, there are other ministries that are sponsored by other churches, other denominations. Maybe they are churches that we don't necessarily agree with everything they do. Maybe they're denominations that we don't agree with a number of things that they do. But Jesus' point here isn't, hey, you got to check and make sure that their statement of faith is in order. Hey, you got to go and take a look at their church and make sure that everything is hunky-dory at their church. Otherwise, you should be critical of that ministry or of that individual. Jesus is saying, whatever they're doing in my name, that's a good thing. And so I hope that you and I will take the lesson that Jesus has for the disciples here, as John's trying to change the subject from the main topic at hand, and that we will be supportive of others' ministries. Now, going back to the subject that was at the heart of this, that John tried to change the subject from, the most important lesson that this passage has for us is this. As disciples, we should equate greatness with servanthood. As disciples, we should equate greatness with servanthood. And friends, in this passage, Jesus is trying to help the disciples to understand that whatever obsession that culture did or didn't have with greatness 2,000 years ago, Jesus was trying to take that and turn it completely upside down and say, you want to be the greatest, then you need to be humble like this little child. And you need to be the servant of all. And that was something that Jesus talked about a number of times in the Gospels. And it's a good reminder for us. Because let me ask you this. In our culture that we live in the year 2024, how do we measure success? I should say, how does our culture measure success? And if we're being honest, our culture measures success mainly through wealth and through power, right? I mean, I'm sure you could add to that list, but I think those two things are at the very top of the list, wealth and power. And power is something that the disciples were talking about in this passage, and Jesus was saying, let go of your obsession with power, and instead try to be humble, don't worry about who's watching, and try to be like this little one. And I deeply admire the Christians over the past 2 millennia who have done exactly that have had incredible ministries, and nobody knew about it because they were humble and because they weren't seeking the limelight. One person that comes to mind, of course, is Mother Teresa of Calcutta, the incredible ministry that she had in India. And there's an excellent chance that no one would have ever known about that. The fact that she did ultimately get attention for that ministry, I think that's a good thing because simply of the example that it set for the rest of us. And look, I will be the first to say that there have been times in my life, and there have been times, unfortunately, in my ministry, when I have not been the most humble person. I'm just confessing that right now. And I hope that over the course of the rest of my life, that whatever I do, I will seek to do with humility, and I will seek to serve others, because that is what Jesus says you and I and all of us, that we need to do if we want to be truly great. So that's where we're going to leave off today. Now, as we prepare to make our segue to our time of communion, I just want to remind you of Jesus' words recorded in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." So right now, before the video cuts me off, I'm going to go ahead and grab my communion elements. I'm going to invite you to get your communion elements as now, and I'm going to invite you to partake with me at this time the body of Christ broken for us. We partake in remembrance of him, and the blood of Christ shed for us. We drink in remembrance of him. Let us pray.